everyone. So today I'm going to read out a chapter from one of my favourite books, Carspotting by Sandy McNair, The Real Adventures of Irvine, Welsh. Sandy was, I assume still is, a very good friend of Irvine's. And this book kind of chronicles some of the adventures they would have got up to together. They got off some pretty mad stuff, as the chapter I'm about to read out will show. So the chapter I'm going to read out is called Albert Kidd. Now, I'm going to, as the title of the video implies there, if you're a Hearts Midlothian football club or fan or Hearts to the layperson, you might want to give this a skip, as it will bring back some pretty awful memories, I'm sure. But to give a bit of backdrop to the story of the day that is talked about in this chapter, it was the 3rd of May 1986, so it'll be 35 years this May. It was the final day of the Scottish football season. Hearts were 2 points clear of Celtic and had a goal difference that was 4 goals better. Okay. Now at the time, only 2 points was available for a win in Scottish football. So essentially, Hearts just needed to avoid defeat. A draw would have done them. And in actual fact, they could have won the championship if they lost the game, so long as Celtic did not overturn the goal difference advantage by winning by 5 goals at St Mirren at Love Street. Bearing in mind that Hearts hadn't lost the match in September 1985, which is a phenomenal run, to be fair. Almost a full season. Now, they obviously must have lost a lot of games earlier in the year, because they lost a few. But that was the situation. So the odds were heavily stacked against Celtic going into the last game of the season. It was Hearts' title to lose, very much. And this chapter we're going to pick up is when the Hibs fans, which Sandy and Irvine Welsh were passionate Hibs fans, were trying to come to terms with the fact of Hearts winning the league for the first time in 26 years. The last time they won the league was in 1960. So the chapter I'm about to read out tells the story of the day they spent in London, a very eventful day, as it happened for other reasons later on as well. And it is one of my favourite chapters of any book that I've written. I think it's brilliantly told, and it's very cleverly displayed by Sandy. So I hope you enjoy it. I was reading Irvine Welsh books motivated me to go to a Hearts Hibs game at Easter Road. It was on my bucket list for ages, and I went to one in March last year, a week before lockdown, and I took footage from the game, the penalty, and the Hearts fans celebrating, and you got a fair few views on YouTube. A lot of Hearts fans were commenting and thanking and all that, so they may not be thanking me for this vid, so apologies in advance, but it's very well told, so I hope you enjoy it anyway. After the dust had settled slightly over the latest London adventure, I found myself alone in the flat one day, wielding a black marker pen and a sizable sheet of white cardboard. Slowly and deliberately I took up the pen and wrote the following on the white background, in block capitals: "Do not return to London again for any reason." I stood back to admire my handiwork and felt that there was perhaps something missing. A mental light bulb flashed on in my head, and I changed the full stop to a comma before adding, "particularly if it involves Welsh in any shape or form," in block capitals as well. That was better. After all, what on earth was the point in running away from the Edinburgh police when any encounter with their metropolitan brethren was guaranteed to be at least twice as traumatic? I placed this piece of minimalist artwork on the mantelpiece, where I could hardly avoid seeing it, and vowed to heed its message. I was repeating the mantra under my breath when the telephone rang. The bastards are going to do it, aren't they? The bastards are going to actually win the fucking league. I nodded dumbly at the sound of Irvine's distraught voice crackling down the wires from London. Having just watched Dundee United throw in the towel and lose 3-0 at home to Hearts on television, I had to concur with this unpalatable possibility. But hope in Highby's Hearts had been ebbing away for weeks now, as our city rivals had piled 1-0 victory upon 1-0 victory. Now with this resounding win, they looked virtually unstoppable in their demented charge towards the Premier League title of 1986. In the usual childish manner of soccer saddos, we had spent the previous 13 years casting up Hibs' famous 7-0 win on New Year's Day 1973 at Tynecastle to Hearts followers wherever we could find them. As we drank in a staunch Hearts pub at the time, the Diggers, just a stone's throw from Hearts' Tynecastle Stadium, they weren't exactly hard to find. And like the Boer War adversaries of Corporal Jones and Dad's Army, they didn't like it up 'em, not one little bit. So I realised with a sinking feeling that was all about to change. The gloating that would accompany Hearts' first trophy-winning success in about 300 years would be absolutely unbearable. Even worse, acquaintances of mine who had never previously exhibited any interest in the beautiful game had taken to swanning around in brand new maroon and white favours, desperate to ride the bandwagon whilst they could. There was clearly only one course of action open to me. I would have to leave the country immediately. However, plans to get as far away from Edinburgh as possible, Tibet was penciled in as a possible destination, ran into the ground as soon as myself and two fellow escapees stopped off in the capital city of that strange land adjoining our own. We simply couldn't get out of it again. The social quagmire that surrounded Welsh and his entourage was entirely to blame for this. Before we knew it, the day we were dreading rolled around as we lay there on Porno Joe's floor, idly perusing the latest additions to his library of obscenity. Dins Park, Dundee, was where the unthinkable was due to occur in a few hours' time. The home team were no great shakes, and there was little doubt that Hearts, with a run of over 30 unbeaten games to their credit, would emerge triumphant. Even if they lost, Celtic would need to score a barrel-load in their game away to St Mirren to overhaul the leaders in goal difference. I tried to take my mind off things by concentrating on hot-blooded Dutch tailors, but to no avail. As usual, the delicate mechanism of my body clock had suffered a spanner being rudely chucked in its works by Irvine. His infuriating habit of leading us on a succession of Welsh wild goose chases had continued unabated, dragging us mile after mile across the city to late opening clubs and other sundry dives, which would turn out to not open late at all or not exist in the first place. I always found riding the underground a depressing and exhausting business anyway, dodging pickpockets, assorted bampots, and high-quality beggars of Glaswegian origin. Then there was the usual series of impromptu all-night parties at a variety of locations, with the attendant risk of confrontation with police officers summoned by irate neighbours. This meant we would generally awaken on someone's floor in the afternoon before heading out for breakfast, come lunch, come dinner. All the people I seemed to know in London were adept at keeping their homes well stocked with booze, drugs, pornography, and illegal weaponry, but food storage appeared to be an alien concept. I left the Dutch tailors to their own unspeakable devices and joined my fellow dossers who were heading out for sustenance. As we sat in a greasy Brixton cafe trying to digest something strange and unidentifiable at around 3:30, we became aware of the indistinct voices emanating from the radio behind the counter. This came from a sports announcer who was muttering something about Dundee taking a 1-0 lead. As such, it wasn't much to get excited about, bearing in mind the frequent inability of English pundits to differentiate between Dundee and Dundee United, and indeed this score turned out to be incorrect, but we weren't to know it at the time. However, Evil Arch leapt up like he'd been plugged into the mains and swung by a swarm of bees simultaneously, knocking over cups and saucers in his agitation. "Turn it up! Turn it up!" he yelled at the poor woman behind the counter, who looked terrified but duly obliged. Even then, rumours were starting to filter through about Celtic cracking them in at Love Street, but with the reportage focusing almost entirely on the English Championship race, nothing was very clear. We dived out of the cafe post-haste and raced back to Porno Joe's, where the diminutive filth hoarder swiftly put aside Ice Maidens of Stockholm and demanded to know the reason for all the hysteria. "Hearts are getting gubbed," shrieked Evil Arch. "Maybe," I cautioned. "Maybe not," retorted Brixton's premier purveyor of continental glossy magazines. At half-time it was 0-0. "What? According to the TV anyway." "Shite. How about Celtic?" "Look," said our host irritably, "I don't care about Celtic. I care even less about Hearts. I've told you all many times that Dunfermline Athletic are the only team worth bothering about. The Pars have a long, illustrious history, during which—" His flow of speech was abruptly halted as Welsh pitched a well-timed copy of Almost Too Big at him, and I switched the TV back on. But predictably, all the talk was of Liverpool and Everton. We spent the next hour or so in an agony of suspense. Viewing Rugby Bloody League was never my idea of a good way to pass an afternoon, and never less so than now, as I stared frantically at the screen, my face a churning sea of apprehension. I realised it was absolutely pathetic, of course, this deranged desire to see unexpected misfortune descend on what were, to a large extent, inhabitants of our hometown. But that did nothing to dilute the feeling. Far from it. After interminable footage of 15-stone boneheads rocking about in the mud, the picture changed and some familiar-looking bill-creamed muppet swam into view. He wore that slightly alien look that is the trademark of the Scottish football presenter. The screen then cut to footage of some initially unidentified ground where hordes of green, white and yellow-clad people were dancing on the pitch. Cue the commentator's hysterical tones. An incredible scenes here in Paisley where against all odds Celtic have clinched. That night, the partying surpassed anything that had gone on before. In the days before London Hibs became an official entity, a loose aggregation of Easter Road expatriates would occasionally gather under the banner of the Essex and East London Hibs Supporters Club, or so Irvine claimed, but I suspected that they merely consisted of himself and Robert the Croydon Hibby. If so, the entire membership was certainly up for it that night. So just to explain there what happened, Celtic won their game 5-0. They did their job. But Hearts did their job up until the 3rd minute of the game, where a man called Albert Kidd, a Celtic supporter as it happens, popped up and scored and added insult to injury, added a second goal 4 minutes later, breaking Hearts and handing the title to Celtic. So later in the chapter there, I'm going to talk about Albert Kidd again, but that was just to give the backstory there. Celtic won the league, and obviously the lads are delighted because Hearts haven't. A heartbreaking way to lose a league. You wouldn't really wish it on your worst enemy, but in this case they did. Okay, we move on. Robert was a top-ranking civil servant who enjoyed the quiet life in the south, or at least he had done, until Welsh became his near neighbour. It was amazing how even the most conservative of people could be led astray by Irv, as was proven by a bizarre incident that had occurred not long before. For reasons that were never made entirely clear, the pair had been apprehended by hotel security while masquerading as Australian rock stars as they attacked shocked guests in the corridors of a 5-star establishment with well-aimed jets of water from fire hoses. Welsh seemed to labour under the delusion that his former incarnation as a shite punk guitarist gave him the right to indulge in archetypal rock and roll behaviour as the fancy took him. With the climax of what would forever after be referred to as Albert Kidd Day, in honour of the player who scored the 2 goals that broke hearts in Dundee, was possibly even more eventful. We had piled into Mrs. Welsh's car at pub closing time in search of more action. Anne had not long passed her test and was particularly nervous as 1. The car was full of screaming drunks, 2. It was horribly overcrowded, containing 7 of the aforementioned inebriates, namely myself, Irvine, Fox, Porno Joe, Stu, Amphetamine Arthur, Evil Arch, and of course the driver, and 3. 2 of the passengers were in possession of sufficient quantities of illegal drugs, which if we were intercepted by the police, would see us banged up in Wormwood scrubs until Hearts next nearly won the league, which hasn't happened in the last intervening 35 years, I would say, as an aside. In other words, for a very long time. As Welsh had the window wound down and was bawling unintelligible gibberish at passers-by, this seemed not entirely unlikely, and the next suggestion from Stu made it almost inevitable. This was that we should detour via Rupert Murdoch's News International plant at Wapping, where nightly picketing by strikers had been getting increasingly more violent. As was common in London, all sorts of other bedsit revolutionaries, anarchists and anti-social maniacs with their own political or personal agendas had joined their ranks. People just like Stu, in fact. But we had to show solidarity with our opposed brethren in the proletarian struggle, he informed us sternly. Welsh carried on screaming out of the window. Myself, Fox and Evil Arch carried on stikily drinking. Arthur carried on popping pills. Anne and Porno Joe carried on looking like they wished they were somewhere else entirely. Although Irvine's revolutionary credentials were in no way comparable to Stu's, he had idly dabbled in anarchy in the UK, or in Crammon Village to be precise. As a disciple of some warehouse freedom fighter with psychiatric problems, he would occasionally be ordered to hurl the odd petrol bomb at a tree with a target painted on it. but that was when he'd been much younger and foolish. Now that he was older and foolish, however, it still gave him a cheap thrill when the first homemade bomb flew past our vehicle with a whoosh and exploded against the parked car, setting ablaze picturesquely beneath the night sky. It appeared that we had arrived at Wapping. The air was filled with the angry, confused roar that a huge, uncontrollable mob makes when it's uncertain who to put the sword to next. Stu let out a whoop of joy. Anne had fearfully slowed the car down, and we were almost at a halt anyway, when the policeman appeared out of nowhere, his hand raised ominously in a stop gesture. 10 years at least, I thought, with no parole. Our driver appeared frozen in shock and just managed to bring the car under control before it collided with the size 12 boots. Luckily, her husband had stopped screaming just in time, and it was Anne's turn to wind her window down as the law loomed up before us. You can't go through this way, he stated firmly. But as an opening line, it certainly beat, do you mind if I search your passengers? I reasoned. Why not? Responded Anne timidly. He sighed. As the sky was lit up like bonfire night, with petrol bombs arching through the air, he probably thought it was obvious. There's a riot going on. Up in cell block number 9, added Irvine rashly. The cop's demeanour changed instantly, and he glared suspiciously in at the car's occupants for the first time. Here it comes, I thought. Up against the wall, motherfuckers, but you've the right to remain silent. However, he just indicated that we would have to turn around and return the way we'd come. Anne desperately manoeuvred around in the confusing darkness. Apart from the occasional flare from petrol bombs some 100 yards away, it was virtually pitch dark, as a lot of streetlights had apparently been smashed earlier. Now we had additional complications, as Stu and Arthur wanted to be let off nearer the scene of protest. I just wanted to go back to Irvine's or Porno Joe's and drink beer. Fox and Evil Lurch wanted huge amounts of Indian food. Porno Joe wanted nothing more than a chance to curl up with a good book of the not-to-be-sold-to-minors variety. Welsh apparently wanted a man after midnight, if his enthusiastic rendering of the ABBA classic was to be taken at face value. However, next minute our preferences were rendered entirely superfluous. Anne turned the corner and accelerated forward, right into the midst of one of the worst rides of the decade. The air throbbed with sound and fury as police horses snickered wildly and thundered through the baying mob, completely out of control. Glass smashed relentlessly as an ever-ending stream of petrol bombs soared towards the police lines, and scary, demented-looking people, smeared in blood, charged around with scaffolding poles and other makeshift weapons. The sky was obscured by thick palls of smoke, through which golf balls, paving slabs, and other missiles rained down. Even through the firmly closed windows, we could hear the terrible screams of people being trampled underfoot as a woman with a shopping trolley raised above her bloodied head fell against the bonnet. It was clearly a time for stout hearts and brave deeds, for courage and valour. How would the contemporary heroes of our violent age have responded? What would Albert Kidd have done? We eventually got out of the inferno by pure luck, i.e. by Anne accelerating away from the mayhem at top speed and to fuck with anyone unlucky enough to get in the way. The angry roar diminished to a mere whisper on the horizon as we put as much distance between ourselves and Rupert Murdoch's personal Alamo as possible. I now understood only too well the concept of newspaper wars. But our opposed brethren would have to make do without us this time around. We hastened back to Irvine's and proceeded to consume large quantities of whiskey until 6 a.m. Around this time, our host decided that it might be a good idea to telephone as many heart-supporting acquaintances as he could to offer sincerest condolences, in inverted commas. The astronomical level of rage expressed by a Jambo Begbie, who was called up anonymously, was such that we all quaked in our boots, despite being 400 miles away. On awakening in the late morning, we learned that we had indeed experienced the worst night of violence at Wapping so far, with over 300 police officers injured. Stu had been a busy boy. Predictably, the television and newspapers made little reference to the casualties on the other side. Disgracefully, even less mention was made of Albert Kidd's heroics, but we had that to look forward to on returning north of the border. There wasn't much excuse for hiding out in the smoke any longer, now that the awful threat of Jambo jubilation had been lifted. Foolishly, though, we did stay on to take in a folk festival, which was set to be staged in St. George's Park. The Pogues were meant to be headlining, but then lead singer Shane MacGowan managed to get himself run over whilst drunk some nights before, so they pulled out. The whole event had been badly promoted, if at all, and the attendance numbered in the hundreds rather than the thousands who might reasonably have been expected to turn up had the boys from County Hell put in an appearance. Still, it was nice and peaceful lying there with Fox and Evil Lurch in the afternoon sunshine. Welsh had poured withering scorn on the whole shebang and taken himself off to the boozer. So when a rumpus developed at the entrance to the site, we paid little attention at first. It continued to grow in intensity, and more people became distracted as the police presence around the fence started to multiply rapidly. We took a closer look and recoiled instantly in alarm. Irvine and Stu, completely out of their heads and armed with objects that looked suspiciously like scaffolding poles, were attempting to gatecrash. As the former hadn't wanted to go in the first place, I surmised that he'd been roped into these antics by Stu, who was obviously still on a high after attempting to overthrow the Murdoch Empire the previous evening. Truly, the People's Revolution never slept. But what political objective could be attained by storming a gathering of men with beards and fingers in their ears singing "Hey Nonny No" was beyond me. As they were repelled by the thin blue line, I heard Irvine defiantly yell something about Albert Kidd. The following day we returned to Edinburgh and dropped in at the Diggers for a pint. It occurred to me for the first time that Glaswegians are spot on when they complain that Edinburgh folk are stuck up and unfriendly. For some reason, no one would speak to us. I wonder why that was. And Hibs fans, I suppose, took full advantage of the unfortunate situation that Hearts found themselves in. And the 3rd of May has been christened as Sir Albert Kidd Day by Hibs fans. And I'm not sure if they still do it, but it was celebrated yearly at one stage. So it's still very much appreciated in Leith, those 2 goals by Albert Kidd. Albert Kidd has also been invited by Celtic supporters to speak at functions, and it kind of reminds me of the fondness that Republic of Irish football fans have for Gary McKay of Scotland, who's also referenced in another Irvine Welsh in Trainspotting, because Gary McKay scored the goal that knocked Bulgaria out and made Ireland qualify for Euro 88. So that would have been 1987. So Gary McKay has a very special place in Republic of Ireland fans' heart, Irish people's heart. He scored a very important goal that helped us. So there are similarities there, 100%. No, I also read an article and a quote from this. I read an interview with Albert Kidd and Sandy Clark, who was playing for Hearts at the time, and was a big player for him. He was saying how that Albert Kidd rubbed salt in the wounds with his comments about being a Celtic supporter. And to quote Andy Clark, Albert Kidd, who was somebody I don't know that well, I would have liked to have kicked his head in, not then his common sense and his bit about teams he supported. So Kidd's kind of reaction to that, 3 decades later, was, had he said this right after the game and continued to say this for a couple of years, so be it, and I wouldn't have been surprised. But 33 years on is a long time between drinks. And he recalls meeting Sandy Clark at the Scottish Football Writers Association dinner in Glasgow in 2016, so exactly 30 years on from then. So 30 minutes into the function, I noticed Sandy Clark at a table nearby. I approached him and greeted him saying, "Sandy Clark, it has been a while, sir, how are you?" His response was delayed, and my first thought was, geez, he doesn't even know me. I proceeded to tell him who I was, and he answered by saying, "I know who you are." So the conversation was fabulous and lasted 8 to 10 seconds. I knew from that moment that he was still hurting, and if I continued speaking, he may well have got a bit out of sorts. So Albert Kidd at this point said, "I would like it to be put on record by saying that I am truly sorry that Hearts never won the championship in 1986. Yes, I had a hand in the end result, and Celtic, who I follow and support, benefited greatly. However, I must say that I was sincerely and absolutely gutted for all of the lads at Hearts on that day in May 1986 at Dundee, and this includes Sandy Clark, who I respected as a very good professional football player and who I first met and played against way back in 79-80 when he was the captain at Airdrie and I was the captain in Motherwell." So there's an apology from the protagonist of this chapter, Albert Kidd, to Heart of Midlothian Football Club. I would have sympathy for Hearts fans as well, because as a Liverpool fan myself, reading this, it wasn't anywhere near as heartbreaking. Well, I suppose it was, but as a Liverpool fan, when Gerrard slipped against Chelsea in 2014 with 3 games to go, that was a kind of a seismic moment in the title race, and it handed the initiative to City, and they went on and won the league. And up until Liverpool winning the league last year, when the duck was finally broken, just the chance about Steven Gerrard slipping on his arse and giving the ball to Dimbaba, etc. And it's commemorated. I think it's April 27th. I even remember the date. It's been thrown back in Liverpool fans' faces ever since, the fact that Gerrard never won a Premier League medal. So I can understand the frustration that Hearts fans have. Like, looking at the table there from 85-86, Hibs finished third last. They finished eighth in the league. A good 22 points behind Hearts. So it wasn't a season to be proud of for them. But as football fans will do, it's all point scoring. It's all getting one up on each other. And to see your bitterest rivals annoyed a league in those circumstances, it's part and parcel of being a football fan, I suppose. And I'm sure Hibs winning the Scottish Cup, Hearts winning the Scottish Cup in 2012, and they beat Hibs 5-1, certainly went a long way to addressing the ill feeling that came from that time. But since then, I suppose that was Hearts' best chance of winning a league in the last 60 years. There's no real question about that. And I don't think they've come anywhere near doing it since then. I'm open to correction, but they were never as close as that anyway. And it definitely left. It was traumatic to lose it like that. It was severely traumatic when it's with 10 minutes to go, not to concede and you have the title, and to not win it from then on. It was cruel, very, very cruel. The other reasons I suppose I like this particular chapter is I'm a Liverpool fan myself, as I mentioned there, and the 3rd of May 1986 was the day that Liverpool clinched the double, as referenced in the chapter there. Now, they mentioned in the chapter that it was the championship race, but it was actually the FA Cup final, the 3rd of May, when Liverpool beat Everton 3-1 to win the FA Cup, and it was their first ever double, so that was an important day. And the fact that the Pogues reference as well, with the folk festival that they went to, so that was nice as well. I'm a big fan of the Pogues, and it was very interesting to see it on that day that the Rupert Murdoch strike in Wapping, the news of the world, for that to happen on that day, and for them to supposed to play some bit of a role in that on the day after winning or in their eyes, it was like Hibs winning something, Hearts not winning the league. A lot of key events in the 80s there kind of came together in that chapter, so I thought that was very, very interesting. I would love to have heard exactly what the Jambo Begbie said when he was woken up at 6 o'clock in the morning, but I'd imagine it's unprintable stuff. But I often wonder, the last thing you want after blowing a league like that, obviously someone with short fuses rang by drunken supporters of your biggest rivals at 6 o'clock the following morning. So I can imagine that didn't go down terribly well. As they said, they were quaking their boots 400 miles away. So I'd like to dedicate this video to a very good friend of mine, a big Celtic fan who's from Dundee originally. Doesn't have great things to say about the place, we'll say, but I think after hearing that story, it might make her a bit prouder to be a Dundonian, to see that they helped her beloved club in the league back in 1986.